Today on Diabetes Connections Type 2, Dana Lewis was diagnosed with something called EPI, exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, a couple of years ago. She'd never heard of it and was shocked to find out diabetes is considered a common co-condition. EPI can cause a lot of discomfort and stomach issues and health issues if left untreated. Dana jumped in, publishing a review of studies, and now creating studies of her own. She'll explain what she's doing, why she needs your help, and more about this condition that doesn't get much attention. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Hello and welcome to another episode of Diabetes Connections Type 2. I'm your host, Stacey Sims. For a very long time, I have hosted a podcast focusing on type 1 diabetes and people who use insulin. There is so much new information about type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, that I wanted to start something for this community. My husband lives with type 2. My son lives with type 1. I don't have diabetes. I have a background in broadcasting and in news. That's how you get the podcast. As you're listening to this episode, I am at a diabetes conference. I'm at Children with Diabetes Friends for Life, which, as you can probably guess, is a conference geared more to people with type 1 and families and that kind of support. Last month, though, I went to the American Diabetes Association's Scientific Sessions Conference. So much happened there. I'm going to have lots more to come, interviews on research, technology. But Dana Lewis was there, presenting a poster, releasing information, and talking to people about EPI. Dana Lewis lives with type 1. She is very well known in that community because she is a DIY pioneer. There is a very big do-it-yourself diabetes community. These are folks that filled the gap years ago before technology was able to communicate. There was not a lot of interoperability. It's a very long story. If you're interested, I will link up the We Are Not Waiting episodes of the Type 1 show in this episode's show notes. You can also search the hashtag We Are Not Waiting, all one word, on any social media platform, and you'll see a lot of these folks. I mean, Dana created something called DIYPS, the do-it-yourself pancreas system, in 2013 because she just wanted better alarms on her pump. That's the tip of the iceberg of what she has done. But what I want to talk to you about today is EPI. Dana was diagnosed with this a few years ago and was stunned to find, not just very little information about it, but also that 20 to 30% of people with diabetes can develop it, and that is any type of diabetes. In a very Dana Lewis move, she has just released a free web-based tool where you can find out if symptoms you have match EPI symptoms. You'll get a score you can take to your doctor to talk about it. One quick warning, we're going to be talking about bathroom stuff here, so if hearing about that makes you kind of queasy, but you still want the info, the Apple Podcast app has a really great transcription service now. It's built right in. It's easy to find. Reach out if you have any issues with me. You can also just jump to the links in the show notes and get more information and head out to that web tool to take the test to find out your risk. All right, my conversation with Dana Lewis right after this. It can be pretty tricky to travel with insulin, especially if you're going somewhere very cold or somewhere very hot. We have found something that really works well for us, and that is the ViviCap from Tempramed. It keeps your insulin at the exact right temperature, even in the extreme heat or cold, and it works for any insulin pen. Super simple. You just take the cap off your insulin pen and you slide the ViviCap on. No batteries, no charging, no water or ice packs. It lasts for years and gives you 24/7, 365 protection because insulin is very temperature sensitive. ViviCap has a 30-day, 100% money-back guarantee, and it's got a 2-year warranty. Find out more. I've got a link in the show notes for you, or you can go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Tempramed ViviCap logo. Dana, welcome back. It's always great to talk to you. Thanks for sharing your time to shed some light on this issue. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about it. It's not really well known in diabetes, so it's good to be able to talk about it and let people know what's going on.
I've been doing this podcast for 9 years. I have never talked about EPI. Can you just start by telling us in basics what this is?
Yeah. So EPI is exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. And that's what we know it by here in the US. But elsewhere, in UK, Europe, elsewhere, they call it PEI. So you'll hear pancreatic exocrine insufficiency, but it's the same thing. Basically, our pancreas actually does more than produce insulin. When somebody eats, the pancreas also produces digestive enzymes that help break down the fat, the protein, the carbs that we're eating. And in some people, both in the general population, but also a good number of people with diabetes over time, the level of enzyme production goes down. And people can start to have symptoms of not digesting their food, which we can talk about separately. And that's what the condition is of EPI, is when your pancreas is no longer producing enough enzymes on its own to digest the food. So kind of it's a cousin to diabetes, of the pancreas is no longer producing something you need to work with the food that you're eating.
How does somebody know if they have this?
So some people have really, really clear gastrointestinal symptoms. Classically, it's thought of as diarrhea, gas, bloating, abdominal pain after you eat. But there's also people, including people with diabetes, who get more mild symptoms that occur over time. So you start to notice that certain types of meals, based on the quantity of food, make you feel really, really bad, but other food doesn't bother you. And it's maybe not in clear, is it an ingredient? Is there a food intolerance that you've developed? But you notice that these bigger meals bother you more. And so some people naturally kind of adapt what they're eating in response to symptoms, because they notice abdominal pain, lots of gas, messy stools, smelly stools. So just changes in bathroom habits that aren't normal for you, whether or not you would call them diarrhea. But just noticing this isn't quite right, and it's been happening for weeks or months, those can be some of the early signs of EPI.
Bathroom stuff is so vague and can be so many things. I live with ulcerative colitis, and sometimes it's just hard to tell what's going on. How did you get your diagnosis? Do you mind sharing that story?
Yeah. So 3 years ago, I started to have gastrointestinal symptoms that I thought actually were a response to a medication, but they kept happening over time. And eventually I looked back and said, well, even for a year before that, I was starting to notice those bigger meals were really bothering me. But when I started having those bathroom habit changes, that's what really cued me in of something is not quite right anymore. And so I actually went to my gastroenterologist. I had one because I have had celiac disease for almost as long as I've had type 1 diabetes, off by 6 years, but I've had celiac. So I went to my gastroenterologist and said, I've been 100% gluten-free. I'm very careful about cross-contamination. It's not celiac because I already have that. There's something else going on. And we went through a bunch of diagnostic tests. I did a colonoscopy. We did another endoscopy. We did blood tests. We checked for, parasites, all these things. And it kept coming back negative, clear, negative, clear. And I actually, one day after, over a year of suffering these really bad GI symptoms, was on Facebook and saw a post about a friend's dog. And she was talking about how her dog had diarrhea, upset stomach. Turns out the dog had this condition. They sprinkle enzymes on the dog's food and the dog is way better. And I was like, that's so interesting. And I looked this condition up. I'm like, do humans get this? Humans get this. It's called EPI. And so I messaged my doctor and said, this wasn't on the list of 5 or 6 things you were checking for. Should we check for this? And I started reading and realizing, oh, it's known that people with diabetes get this. Why was this never brought up? We tested for it and I have EPI. Started taking enzymes and everything got so much better.
Oh my gosh.
Like night and day within days. It reminds me, it gives me chills right now to think about it. I don't know, for some people like me, I was 14 when I was diagnosed with type 1. And I remember how I felt after the first shot of insulin. And so the first 2 or 3 meals with enzymes where I had the absence of those really terrible symptoms, just that same night and day, oh my gosh, food doesn't hurt to eat. It was a game changer, but that's kind of it took me almost 2 years to get diagnosed. And it was lucking into a Facebook post about a dog to learn that EPI was a thing.
Couple of questions. I mean, so many questions, but what is the test ultimately? Is it a stool
test?
Oh, it's a stool test. I was curious. Is it a blood test? Is it another colonoscopy?
No, I wish it was a blood test. It's a stool test. It's called a fecal elastase test. And what it's testing for is elastase, which is kind of a proxy for how much of these enzymes is your pancreas producing. There's other stool tests. There's a fecal fat test where you collect a sample for 72 hours, and then they actually test how much fat is in that. So that's another method. They can also do more invasive, like looks at your pancreas and test how much it's secreting, but that's invasive and expensive and not ideal. So generally, most people use the fecal elastase test. It's not perfect, right? Like any lab test that you do, like there's a chance of lab error. The sample is going to affect it, but it's a pretty good proxy. But you have to know to order it, right? And so there's a lot of people with gastrointestinal symptoms, especially with diabetes, where their healthcare provider's like, okay, you have diabetes. You're telling me you have these symptoms. We're going to test you for celiac and gastroparesis. And if those come back as negative, not sure what to do, unfortunately.
Exactly.
And that's That's the frustrating thing, is because as I started digging into this to help me understand it, I realized there's actually a very high prevalence. Not, 100% of people, but up to 30% of people with diabetes might have lowered elastase. And that's a pretty big number of people with diabetes. And therefore, we should be screening for this. But the screening rates don't correlate with that number at all.
Can I ask, do you mean 30% of people with all types of diabetes, type 1?
Type 1 and type 2. I did a systematic review last year, and there's a published paper, and it's available on my site for free for people to go read. And both type 1 and type 2 have this really clear prevalence. There's some studies that find it in, 10 or 15% of diabetes. Some find it at a little bit higher. Kind of depends on the population that's being tested, but it's many times more common both in type 1 and type 2 diabetes than celiac and gastroparesis.
But not talked about, except if you have a dog on Facebook. That's incredible.
Yes. Well, that's kind of become, if you follow me on Twitter or elsewhere, you see me post about this pretty frequently. And every single time I post about it, I say, people with diabetes, if you have GI symptoms, ask your doctor about it. And if you don't have GI symptoms, just put in the back of your brain, like knowing to check for celiac. Your doctor may not think to screen you for EPI, but we've got to raise awareness among people with diabetes and healthcare providers, because there's probably a lot of people walking around right now undiagnosed and suffering, unfortunately.
I would imagine, Dana, that you have a pretty big, not just a following, a great network. You've been involved in a lot of academic endeavors over the last, I'm going to say 10 years, because that's when I've known you, but certainly I'm sure before that. What has been the reaction? Are people believing this when you're telling them about them? Are you changing minds? I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'll let you answer.
No, that's great. Luckily, people believe the data. I'm not doing original research. Like last year, I started with a systematic review, and I was really pleasantly surprised by feedback and response from healthcare providers. I've actually heard from a number of endocrinologists who said, because of your paper last year, I started testing people for EPI, and yeah, I'm finding cases of EPI left and right. And that just means everything to me, because I do this research on the side because I want to, fix this for people, do what I can from the bottom up. And so to hear endocrinologists and other healthcare providers say, yes, I'm going to screen people with diabetes, and like primary care doctors in the UK reaching out and saying, I've started screening people with diabetes now that I understand that that's correlated and there's higher rates in people with diabetes than the general population. So if they have GI symptoms, this is something that we're going to check. So that's been really, really great, but that's a handful. And I would love to see us change this more quickly and this kind of become the standard of care, which is why I've been interested in looking at what are the problems with screening today? Why aren't doctors screening for it? I talked about the test not being perfect. So if the test isn't perfect, is there something else we could do to improve the pretest probability and the accuracy of this test? Like, what can we do? And so that's really where I went from the systematic review last year of saying, okay, now we've really confirmed that, yes, there is this correlation with diabetes. What can we do about it? And so that's kind of where I focused in the last year.
And what I love about you is when you say, what can we do about it? What you really mean is, what can I do to jump in here and build on what others have and be very collaborative? I know you're not one to say, I did this and, I'm on my soapbox alone. But talk to me about this scoring system that you've put together.
Yeah, well, it really came in response to engaging with the community of people with EPI. Because when I was diagnosed, my elastase score was on the upper end of what you consider to be EPI. And my doctor didn't even consider it to be EPI. He said, you can try the enzymes if you want, but I don't think they'll help, and it's not going to hurt for you to try it. Well, again, I took them. Absolute night and day game changer. I have EPI, no question about that. And so I started looking at the literature to say, what is the definition clinically of EPI? How is this diagnosed? What does it mean? And the majority of these research papers talk about some really classic signs of EPI, like diarrhea, seeing oil and fat in your stool, a ton of weight loss. But that didn't match my experience. And so as I talked to other people with and without diabetes with EPI, I realized there's a much broader presentation of symptoms. Everybody's different depending on where you kind of catch it and kind of what their body is like. And so I was like, every other, survey tool, and basically if it's not a stool test, it still focuses on diarrhea. And for people who don't have diarrhea or this massive unexplained weight loss, they're being excluded from EPI, even if they probably do have EPI. And so I started making a list of what are all these symptoms I see people talking about. I did another systematic review on EPI more broadly, looking at dosing guidelines, looking at how people get diagnosed. And I talked to a lot of people and made this list of symptoms. And I said, could we develop a score that people could use and then take it to their doctor to have that shared decision-making conversation around, should I be screened? What does this mean? Or otherwise to just help people talk about their symptoms. Because like you said, talking about bathroom stuff is hard, right? Like what I don't call diarrhea, somebody else might call diarrhea. right? And so like the way we talk about bathroom habits, that's hard. So how do we quantify all this? And when I say this really bothers me, how do I say that this is the most bothersome thing in my life? And it is, it is wrecking my day, depending on what the symptoms are and everything. So I actually came up with this list of symptoms and a rating scale that included both the frequency of when and how often these symptoms occur, from every day, most days of the week, once a month, never. And then also how severe it is. Doesn't really bother me, super bothers me. And so this score was basically take all these symptoms, rate them, multiply them, you get this total score. And so I wanted to validate it as much as I could to say, does this work for somebody other than me? Which is always the question, right? You start with N of 1 and then you want to scale it and see if it's something that works. And so I put it out to the world and gave it to people to take and did a full research study on it. We ended up getting 324 people to fill it out, which is great, both people with EPI and people without EPI, because I wanted to see, could we distinguish from like everyday GI symptoms, right? Because occasionally you have diarrhea, occasionally you have gas, occasionally you don't feel well after you eat. But it's the combination of frequency and severity, as well as the number of symptoms, that really differentiates EPI from no condition, or EPI from something else like celiac, ulcerative colitis, and these other conditions. So I was able to do this study, get this data, and show that, yeah, this scoring tool that we call the EPI PEISS, so the symptom score for EPI, and be able to say that, yeah, if you score high on this, there is a good chance you might have EPI, and you should talk to your doctor about getting tested. If you have a lower score or a score kind of around that middle area, you still could have EPI. And so if you want to, talk to your doctor about it. But the lower the score, it's less likely that you have an obvious presentation of EPI. So that's where we're at right now. I built this tool, tested it with the community, and we had so many amazing people with diabetes who filled it out that we had enough data to do a diabetes sub-study, because I wanted to see, we always have the question, like, do people with diabetes have the same experience as everybody else with these other conditions? And in this case, what the data from the sub-study is showing us for both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, the answer is yes. People with diabetes, if you have EPI, these symptoms are really burdensome. You have more symptoms more often, and they stink. Like, they're just miserable, just like if you didn't have diabetes. And so this is the first study that shows that this could be used for people with diabetes to help maybe identify cases of EPI or drive conversations about screening for EPI. And the plan is to do follow-up studies and compare it to that stool test to say, eventually, could we replace the stool test with this survey? We don't know the answer to that yet. We're going to do some future studies. But where we are right now is we have some data showing this survey seems to be a good screening tool. And so I've got this paper coming out and this poster coming up at ADA Scientific Sessions about this, but I didn't want to just do an academic paper and make people who are interested go read, an attachment to the paper about to find this score. So I actually built a simple web tool that allows people to take it and fill out their symptoms and get their score. It's not making any promises at the end. It says, here's your score. Here's how you could consider using it. You're above that cutoff. You're below that cutoff. Here's how you might want to talk about it with your doctor if you're concerned. And there's a button where you can save a PDF, print it out, and take it in with you to your doctor. And it links to the research papers as well. But I really wanted to have a tool in the hands of people with diabetes, because again, I know many of us have symptoms. Many of us are, not being flagged by our doctors as being at risk for EPI because of diabetes. And so this was my attempt to say, okay, bottoms up from the community, here's a tool we can use now to initiate those conversations with our clinicians who may not yet be aware of that, that overlap and that correlation between diabetes and EPI.
Is the tool you mentioned, you can print the PDF, you take the quiz first and print the PDF. Is that at ADA only, or is it a publicly available tool?
It is a publicly available link. I'm going to give it to you and you can put it in the show notes so people can find it. So you can take the web tool. I have a blog post that explains a lot more. I have preprints both for the overall 324 person paper and also the diabetes sub-study, which has 118 people with diabetes with and without EPI. And we have the data for both type 1 and type 2. The patterns are the same. So you can say people with diabetes overall don't show any difference compared to people without EPI. But I felt really strongly about having this separate data of people with diabetes to say, while we are at increased rates of EPI, our experiences are pretty similar. Yeah. There's some small distinctions in which symptoms people with diabetes reported. And granted, this is a real world study, and we're going to see if it replicates in future studies. But people with diabetes with EPI tended to score the food-related symptoms of changing their habits related to what they eat, either avoiding those larger meals, avoiding food groups, avoiding fatty foods. And my hypothesis is that that's because we as people with diabetes are pretty in tune with our body, right? When something is not responding after we eat, We play around with our insulin dosing. We might change what we're eating or the timing. There's so many variables, but a lot of people start adjusting what they eat if they can't get their glucose to do what they expect. And what's interesting is I actually did an N of 1 case study published last year where we looked at CGM data before and after somebody was diagnosed with EPI and went on PERT. And even with an automated insulin delivery system, they're getting overall really great time and range. You can see a clear change in the number of spikes above 180 after they ate with enzymes, which shows that the enzymes were helping them digest fat and protein better, and therefore carbs weren't spiking as high. And so for people with diabetes, if they have EPI and they're undiagnosed, it's not just that they have these symptoms and they feel terrible, it's possibly affecting their glucose and what's happening after meals. And it's not because they're doing anything wrong, right? They could be doing all the right things in terms of counting and timing and adjusting insulin and doing their best. But if their body's not digesting the fat and the protein, the carbs are going to hit much more quickly. And the fat and protein is either going to be a lot slower or not get digested at all. And that's going to influence the glucose. Yeah. And so we all know with people with diabetes, there's all this stuff that affects your glucose, right? We know there's a gazillion factors, but this idea of your body is not working with the food that you give it, and it's not consistently doing the same thing when you digest food. It's really, really frustrating because that's one more thing that you feel like you can't control and you can't influence. So that's another reason why I feel really passionate about helping people who are undiagnosed get screened and get diagnosed, because not only do we want to eliminate the gastrointestinal, tummy type symptoms, but also it's a game changer for adjusting glucose. So I'm also really excited to hopefully initiate some research around that to show how effective it can be at helping with glucose.
Yeah. For people with or without diabetes, are there other health issues that can crop up with untreated EPI? As you said, it's not just about the discomfort.
Yeah, I don't think there's really good research on that. I mean, I think the big one is malnutrition in general, right? Wow. If you get malnourished, that's going to affect things like bone health, which people with diabetes are already at risk for in the long term. So it kind of overlaps with a lot of the same kind of long-term diabetes-related concerns. But obviously, people are more concerned about short-term symptoms, but there's those longer-term kind of malnutrition symptoms. Hopefully, most people don't get to that. But it's pretty standard if you get diagnosed with EPI to do blood work to check the levels of your fat-soluble vitamins and see if that's a sign of, yes, you've been deficient in vitamin whatever. Yeah. And that's something that you can help track that as you go on enzymes. You can track that also to make sure that those are coming up and see whether or not you need additional supplementation. But a lot of people get completely diagnosed and they don't have vitamin deficiencies yet. And that's one of the interesting things is people can get diagnosed with a ton of symptoms and have a borderline elastase result, but not have any vitamin deficiencies, and vice versa, not recognize that they have any symptoms other than maybe very variable glucose that they didn't attribute to that. They have a super low elastase and they have vitamin deficiencies, and you just don't know until you check those things.
So let's talk a little bit more about the treatment, though. You've mentioned enzymes, and I'm picturing sprinkling something over dog food, which is obviously not how you do in people. But do you sprinkle a powder or something? Okay, let's talk about it.
It's a pill. Okay. Yeah, so it's an enzyme pill. There's different brands. You'll see me use the acronym PERT. That stands for Pancreatic Enzyme Replacement Therapy, PERT. So I try to say enzymes for short, but PERT means the enzyme treatment. And it's kind of interesting because when most people are diagnosed, they're given a prescription of a certain size. So they come in different size pills, which has how much enzymes they are in. And you're told take 1 or 2 of these with a meal and 1 with a snack. But what I've observed, and I've found in the literature to back this up, is you need to actually adjust the amount of enzymes you take to what you eat, which sounds very familiar to adjusting insulin with carbs, right? So what I ended up discovering within a couple of months is I had to come up with ratios of how much fat to the lipase and the protein to the protease that I was taking. And so as a person with diabetes and kind of like my natural food preferences, I eat a slightly higher fat and protein than carbohydrate diet, right? That might be common among people with diabetes, might not. But it was important to me to titrate both on fat and protein, because if I had a low fat, high protein meal and ate the same and took the same enzyme dose as a medium fat meal, I would have symptoms because I wasn't digesting the protein, right? So there's more variables at play, but you're taking one pill that has 3 types of enzymes for fat, protein, and carbs. So some people can take a fixed dose and they eat kind of roughly the same thing and it works well for them. My diet happens to be really variable in terms of fat and protein and carbs. So for me, I actually like dosing my insulin to match the amount of carbs. I'm also dosing my enzymes to match the fat and protein that I'm eating. But unfortunately, a lot of people are given a pretty small dose to start to see if it works, but it's often way too low of a dose. And so doctors get the feedback, well, it's not working. And they think, oh, well, you don't have EPI. And people get taken off of it, unfortunately. When the reality is there's a bunch of really clear guidelines of you should start with this amount of dose, which most people aren't start with. They start on a lower dose, but they should start on this dose and titrate up. And then here's what happens if you titrate up and it's not effective. Like there's other things to do and other things to check. But most people aren't given that guidance. And most people aren't taught because a lot of clinicians don't realize that adjusting to the amount of food makes a big difference.
Long way to go, it sounds like.
A lot of things to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot to work on.
I'm curious too, and we're going to get a little bit more in the weeds. My son has lived with type 1 for 17 years. And we were told early on, well, he doesn't really have the hormone as well. He doesn't really have the hormone that, regulates hunger like everybody else. There are other things that go along with having diabetes than just, you need to dose insulin. But I kind of felt that back in the back of my head, because what am I supposed to do about that? Right. I knew there were other things lacking and other things that we would have to look for, but what do you do? But I feel like in the last few years, we're getting more and more tools like semaglutides and these GLP-1s and things that are not approved for use in type 1. We're hearing about something like this, which would never have occurred to me to talk to my son about. I guess I have a multi-question. You can answer it however you want. Are we entering a new time of diabetes? I mean, we're super at the beginning here, right? I mean, this is not something that immediately we're going to see changes over. But do you think they're going to start treating diabetes more like the puzzle it is, rather than here's your insulin, oh, here's a CGM, carry on?
I'd love to say yes to that question. But
we both know what the real answer is. But I guess what I'm looking for is like, I don't know. It kind of blows my mind that just in the last couple of years, more mainstream outlets and more, not just on podcasts, right? People are talking about this in a way that hasn't been talked about before. I don't know what it'll really mean.
Well, I think some of it is, we have more tools of communication. So I discovered EPI because of a Facebook post about a dog, right? How long would it have taken me or my doctor to figure it out? Possibly years more, because he thought EPI was very unprevalent. And I was the reason I'm publishing these systematic reviews. I did one in the general population because there's some really good data showing it's up to 10% in the general population. So you walk into a room of 100 people and up to 10 people might have lowered elastase. Whether or not they have symptoms and need enzymes is a different question. But again, 3 out of 10 people out of diabetes possibly have this lowered elastase. And so if you're having symptoms, you should talk to your doctor about screening. You should get tested. You should be trying PERT, on and on and on. And a lot of people in the broader EPI community are talking about, I talked to my nurse practitioner, my doctor, and they've said that they've, never heard of EPI. And all of a sudden they're having, people hear about it. Well, it's also some of the companies that make the products are advertising in the mainstream media more. So there's actually been public radio PSAs about EPI sponsored as a campaign by the pharmaceutical companies that make the enzymes that they're selling. And you can argue about whether that's good or bad. But there was actually at least one paper looking at search results for EPI and enzymes after one of these public radio campaigns, and rates of search and awareness went quite a bit up. And then also with social media, you're seeing stories of people, in your third degree network with different health conditions. You kind of file it back away in your brain of, okay, I learned a little bit about brain tumors or EPI or ulcerative colitis or whatever it is that kind of crosses your social network, and you're kind of aware of that. And that changes kind of what people talk about. People are more comfortable talking about health stuff online and social media and elsewhere. Like, I think there's a lot of things that play a role into that. But it does feel like with diabetes, I think I did what you did too. It's like, well, I can't affect these other things, right? I don't have any control over this hormone regulation in my body. I do what I can with insulin. I have the tools of the CGM and everything else. You don't know what you can do until you have a new kind of target, a marker to work with. And so when I realized I had EPI, it's like, okay, I can titrate my enzymes, right? And I can respond to my symptoms that I can do that. But there's still so much related to autoimmune dysregulation and hormonal dysregulation in my body that I still don't know what I can do. So it's really, do what we can where we can, but just there might be more stuff coming down the pike. But hopefully, we have more opportunities to make bigger changes for more people, but then recognize there's still a lot of people who don't have access to what we consider the basics or what we would want everybody to have. And it's important to have choice, right? Like make sure people are choosing what works for them, but make sure they have the opportunity to make that choice and it's an informed choice and access is equitable. That's got to be true for all of these things. So I think it's complicated. It's a problem. We're here for a number of reasons. But when we think about things like EPI and everything else, it's like there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And that's both overwhelming. Where do you start? And as a patient who's not a doctor, who's not a clinician, like where do you start addressing this problem? But what we've learned from diabetes, and we are not waiting in diabetes technology, is we can work as a community from bottoms up to raise awareness about things and to build and share tools. And that's what gave me the interest and the confidence of saying, well, instead of just burying my tool in a paper that's going on in a journal or on the internet. I want to give this to the community and make sure people with diabetes know this is a tool that they can use anonymously for free and use that to actually change the conversations with their doctors and actually maybe change some real world practice from the community up and not just top down by trying to reach doctors at conferences. So I think we have to kind of take as many strategies and approaches as we can.
Yeah. Using the tool is anonymous. Are you looking for people to take it for research, or is it just you're putting this link is for public use anonymous?
This is for public use anonymous. I do have a click button at the bottom that says, do you want to opt in or out to research? It's clicked by default because I'm not collecting any information that's identifiable. But if you unclick the box, it pops up and says, we confirm we're not going to use it for research. Most people want to share their data, and I wanted to make it as easy as possible. That's why it's kind of opt-in. But if you unclick the box, there's text that confirms we're not going to use this data for research.
I was going to say, but people are going to want to help you. So
yes,
I knew there had to be some kind of opt-in.
No, but I was pleasantly surprised and appreciative of all the people with and without EPI and with and without diabetes who took the initial survey. Like 324 people for a real world survey was huge. Like I was hoping for 100 people. And within 3 weeks, we had 324 people. And then I actually left the survey open. So technically people can still find it and take it, but I'm going to start pointing people to this public link because at the time, the survey didn't provide a score, right? It wasn't trying to influence anybody. It was just trying to take the data and say, is there a relationship between these symptoms, the score, and do you have EPI or not? And the answer was yes. But so I want to give this to people, and it's very much contextualized a way of please share your data because we are still researching and learning about this. And there might be more clusters of people with celiac or people with diabetes who are taking the survey where we can do more with these populations if they donate their data with that. But I also want to make it very clear for people, this is not perfect. It's not validated yet. Here's how you can use it. Based on the score, it says this is above the cutoff. Here's what you might want to do. This is below the cutoff. Here's what you might want to do. And a lot of it's dependent on, are you bothered by these symptoms, right? Most people, when I kind of pilot tested this before the big survey, I had my husband and a handful of friends take it. I had 15 people with and without EPI take it. And some of the things that bothered other people, I would find way more bothersome. And they're like, oh, it doesn't bother me at all. Right. So if there's GI symptoms that don't bother you, that's great. That's fine. And if you don't want to do anything with it, your score's kind of on the cusp or below, like, don't worry about it. Just file it away in your brain. If suddenly it gets worse or you're noticing it's worse trending over weeks, months, years, EPI is correlated with diabetes. It's also correlated with other conditions, but especially among the PWD community, just be aware that this is something that could help you actually track changes over time. So people could come back in 6 months or a year and be like, actually, things have changed. Take it again and be like, last time I think my score was 20. Now it's 74. Maybe I'll mention that in my next endo or primary care appointment, right? I want this to be a tool to give people information. What they do with it, it's up to them. Anonymous, nobody's forcing you to do anything, but it's meant to be an informational tool.
And before I let you go, one thing that I did just occur to me is the treatment. Is this a pharmacy prescription? Is it expensive? Can you just talk a little bit about what you're calling, the enzymes?
Unfortunately, yes, it is expensive. Yes, the default is prescription. One of the challenge with it is it requires a prescription. It's expensive. In some parts of the world, like in UK right now, they have some shortages. So people are having a hard time getting their prescriptions filled and they're having to revert to different sizes, different options. There are over-the-counter versions, but I'm going to say this with a whole bunch of caveats. If you look online for quote unquote digestive enzymes, most of them have very small amounts of lipase, protease, and amylase. So if you take one or two of those OTC pills, they're going to have like 1/5 of what is in one of my prescription pills, which means you're going to take them and say, oh, they helped. It's placebo effect, or it didn't help because it wasn't enough. And so you would have to take 10 of these pills in order to make up what I would take for a standard meal, for example. The other problem is a lot of people end up choosing options that are marketed as digestive enzymes that have like 5 other ingredients in them. And so you might have trouble digesting one of those ingredients or have a reaction to those ingredients and think, okay, taking enzymes doesn't work for me. Well, the prescription ones are just lipase, protease, and amylase. It doesn't have all these other ingredients in it. So the OTC market is unregulated. So you don't know what's in it. The advertised ingredients are probably really, really small. But the more ingredients you throw in, it's really hard to see, is this working and understand, is this working or not? So I would say I have a blog post up on my site that walks through, if you think, if you're undiagnosed or you've been told that you have EPI, but you can't afford it, like here is in my opinion, the safest, most logical way to look through the OTC options. I have some that I link to say these, are just the lipase, protease, amylase ingredients, and trying to show people, here's what you look for in terms of the amounts, the ingredients, to be careful and cautious if you take that approach. Now, that being said, there's some people with EPI who do really, really well on over the counter. And they're doing it because they can't afford the prescription or they can't access the prescription or they respond to the ingredients. Not to say that people can't do well, but I also observe a lot of people just take arbitrary amounts. It's not doing what you would expect to do. And it's because of the quantities or it's because of these additional ingredients. I would just say there's been no studies on equivalency and there's been no, studies on these OTCs and proper studies. And not to say that they don't work for some people, but you have to be very strategic and thoughtful about it. It's not, you can take these 1-to-1. The amounts really, really matter compared to what you're eating. Right. So like dosing insulin, obviously if you switch from a rapid to an ultra rapid insulin, it's got a faster, different peak. It's got a different duration of insulin activity. So you have to kind of be aware as you're switching around. And the same thing with the over-the-counter versions and the prescription versions, which unfortunately are pretty expensive. And coming from diabetes, I'm not new to the expensive things, but enzymes are pretty expensive. But there are patient assistance programs that a lot of people apply for and get complete coverage from, where they get a copay card. So it can feel cost prohibitive, but there are a lot of programs that I've seen people have success getting access to.
It's unfortunately not the answer I was hoping for, of course. But
I'm sorry.
No, I do appreciate the whole, laying out different paths as usual. You've got lots of options, lots of answers. I always appreciate that.
I think the thing is for people to know EPI can happen in people with diabetes. Yeah. If you're having GI symptoms, talk to your doctor. There's a stool test that you can do for it. Could be your primary care doctor who orders it, could be a gastroenterologist, but also your diabetes care provider can order the test. So talk to whoever you see next if you're concerned. If you want to take the tool, we'll post the link. It's available online. You can take it anytime, not collecting any information. It's completely anonymous. You can fill it out. You can take it multiple times. You can save a copy. You can talk with it about your doctor or not. Like the results don't make you do anything, right? It's just information. It's just a way of looking at what your symptoms are and helping you think about that and thinking about how you might communicate it with your doctor if it bothers you. And if you don't have symptoms, great. Congratulations. I'm very happy for you.
A couple of years ago, I saw, it was a post. I don't know if it was a real thing, but it made me laugh. It said your marriage is strong because you can easily talk about poop and bathroom stuff and symptoms. And as I've mentioned, I have ulcerative colitis. And a lot of people know your husband, Scott, because you two were instrumental together in the We Are Not Waiting movement. So I'm sure your marriage is very strong as well with all this discussion that has been going on. How are you doing, though, these days? You don't have to get too personal, but how are you feeling? If this has worked and you're feeling a lot better.
Yeah, with EPI, within weeks to months, everything was so much better. I had more energy. I was back to ultra running. If people are curious, I have some really detailed race reports for my ultra marathons, which we talked about last time, but it talks about the number of pills I swallowed for a 100K race and for a 24-hour race, which was a lot of pills. I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who's ever tracked this, but I think for one of my races, I swallowed like 82 pills because every time I ate something for my ultra marathon fuel, I had to swallow a pill. And so that's actually when I use the over-the-counter options because they're so much cheaper and I only did need small amounts. So every 30 minutes, I'd be taking 1 or 2 pills, eating my snack. In 30 minutes, I'd be taking my pills, eating my snack every 30 minutes for, 62 miles or 100 miles or whatever that is. So that it's been an adventure to kind of figure out how to work that into all the activities I love to do. But I was able to get back to everything that I loved to do and feeling way better, right? It's like diabetes. You can run with diabetes. You can ski, you can whatever. It takes a little bit of work, takes planning, right? Got to have the enzymes, got to have the food. If I don't have the enzymes, I don't eat the food. And making sure that you've got all the supplies that you need. But other than that, you're running like normal, very slowly, but, able to do the things that I want to do. It's been really great. And it's been, it was a huge relief because I felt yuck for several years. And it's so nice to not feel bad.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing this, for doing everything you've done. You're going to help a lot of other people not feel bad too, Dana.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to reach people with diabetes who I don't necessarily know and they wouldn't necessarily see my posts. So I appreciate the opportunity.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's always an honor. Dana, thank you. I will link up all the information that Dana talked about, including the studies and her tool where you can get your score. Let me know what you think about this. We had a huge reaction when I ran this over on Diabetes Connections, the Type 1 podcast. A bunch of people went to their doctors with it because they had some unexplained symptoms. I'd love to know if this helps anybody out there. Please pass it along. And that brings me to another good point. I would love for you to share this show. Launching a new podcast is not an easy thing. We are growing beautifully, but the best way to spread the word is for you to do it with a little bit of word of mouth. So I really appreciate that. Thanks as always to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.